You know, usually when we talk about truth, like universal capital T truth, there's this unspoken expectation that everyone is just going to accept it.
Right, like consensus.
Exactly. Like if we're looking at basic math, 2 plus 2 is 4. Everyone just looks at it, points, and says, yep, there it is.
Yeah, it's comforting.
It is. We like truth to be self-evident. We want it easily categorized and generally agreed upon by, reasonable people. But then you step into the world of intense theological frameworks, and suddenly that whole paradigm is turned entirely upside down.
Oh, completely upside down.
Think about this for a second. What if the ultimate proof that you hold the absolute truth is actually the fact that you are facing intense pushback and isolation?
It's wild, because it completely upends how we validate information in our day-to-day lives. You're shifting from a model where consensus means certainty to a model where consensus means you're probably wrong.
Which is such a massive mental leap. And that is exactly what we're exploring for you today on this deep dive. The source material we have is this fascinating, highly metaphorical religious discourse.
Yeah, it's really dense.
It is. It delves deep into the painful but supposedly necessary mechanics of spiritual growth. And it does this using some incredibly vivid, honestly almost jarring analogies. We are talking about everything from the chemistry of baking bread to the messy, sometimes harsh realities of raising children.
Before we really get into the weeds, though,
Yeah.
we should probably establish some ground rules about the material.
Yeah, good idea.
Because this theological framework uses very strong and, at times, really aggressive language to describe its own structure, and, well, specifically those who oppose it.
Right.
So I just want to assure you, the listener, that we are here simply to unpack the architecture of these ideas. We're just looking at the structural blueprints of a belief system. We are not endorsing the theology itself, nor are we endorsing the harsh language it employs.
I'm really glad you brought that up because our mission here is purely analytical. We are going to decode this complex web of parables to understand exactly how this worldview defines truth.
And what spiritual maturity actually looks like in this framework.
Exactly. And maybe most surprisingly, the dangerous expiration dates it places on old traditions. So let's look at that opening premise. The framework argues that if a belief does not face persecution, it simply cannot be the truth.
Yeah, the underlying logic there is that truth is inherently unpopular. This ideology compares true believers to revolutionary thinkers or, groundbreaking scientists throughout history.
People who were entirely ostracized by their peers before eventually being vindicated.
Right, exactly. So by that metric, truth is always held by a very, very small minority.
It almost treats persecution as a badge of honor. It essentially says the fact that everyone is against us is the mathematical proof that we are right.
And within that small persecuted minority, there's a crucial piece of internal architecture. They have this concept of a faithful servant or a central servant.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does that mean?
Well, the theology insists that, especially in the end times, there isn't some democratic consensus of truth. There is only one central servant appointed to distribute food.
Food being the metaphor for truth or instruction here, right?
Right, distributing food at the proper time.
So one single figure is responsible for feeding the truth to the masses. The material draws direct historical parallels here, doesn't it? Like, it compares this figure to Jesus 2,000 years ago.
It does, and it points to a very specific historical pattern to justify this centralization of power. According to this worldview, divine history always starts with a trickle.
It's never a mass awakening.
Never. It's usually one person who is then accompanied by 3 primary companions.
Oh, wow. Like who?
The framework cites Abraham leaving his homeland with a small group. It cites Noah's 3 sons on the ark. And, of course, Jesus appearing with a tight-knit inner circle.
So the pattern repeats. One central figure bringing the new truth, supported by a tiny fraction of followers, totally against the world.
That's the blueprint, yeah.
Okay, let me push back on that for a second, because this creates a fascinating psychological dynamic. If truth is defined by how much pushback it gets, and all of that truth is filtered through this one unquestionable leader,
Right.
doesn't that risk making believers completely invincible to valid criticism? Think about it like a modern echo chamber or even a conspiracy theory. If an outsider points out a massive logical flaw in your belief, you don't engage with the flaw.
You just say, persecution.
Exactly. You just say, the fact that you are attacking my logic is just proof that I'm holding the truth.
That is the exact psychological mechanism at play, and it's incredibly powerful. By framing all opposition as validation, the system creates a perfectly closed loop.
It's kind of brilliant in a terrifying way.
It really is. Any external critique, no matter how rational, doesn't weaken the belief. It actually reinforces it. The pushback from the outside world becomes the very mortar holding the bricks of their worldview together.
Wow, so if you aren't being criticized, you start to worry that you've lost the path.
Exactly.
That is deeply unsettling, but logically airtight if you accept the premise.
Okay, so we have the central servant providing the food, the truth. But acquiring this spiritual food is only step one.
Right, because the framework is incredibly strict about how that food is consumed. Yeah, and it all depends on a person's level of spiritual maturity.
This is where we see a very rigid hierarchy of diet. The transition from drinking milk to eating meat is central to how they view human development.
The parenting analogy used here is so visceral. The imagery describes new believers being fed milk, which makes sense. You have to start with the basics.
Yeah.
But the mandate is that they must quickly transition to solid food. And the imagery gets surprisingly graphic. It describes a mother who continues to spoon-feed an adult or an older child as crazy or neurotic.
The language is deliberately shocking. The goal is to induce a sense of shame around spiritual complacency.
It really paints this picture of a boy who, by age 4 or 5, should be a gentleman eating on his own, using a spoon or chopsticks. So translating that to the spiritual realm, believers have to stop waiting around to be spoon-fed basic, comforting platitudes by their teachers.
They have to learn to handle the complex, difficult doctrines.
The meat.
Right, the meat all by themselves.
It's like someone hiring a personal trainer and then demanding the trainer also chew their chicken and broccoli for them.
That's such a good way to put it.
I mean, at some point, you have to do the heavy lifting with your own jaw.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. This ideology is demanding rigorous spiritual autonomy from its followers. It heavily criticizes those who just want to show up on a Sunday, sit in a pew, and passively receive a comforting message.
Right.
To survive in this framework, you must develop the cognitive and emotional capacity to process complex, sometimes painful truths without needing a leader to break it down into baby food.
But once you're finally chewing that solid food, how does it actually change you? Because a belief system can't survive just by people memorizing difficult concepts. It has to alter their identity.
It does.
And to explain how that internal transformation happens, we have to look at these bizarre agricultural and baking metaphors in the text.
These parables aren't just quaint stories to make the teaching sound pretty, either. They function as precise, mechanical blueprints for how teaching operates on the human psyche.
I want to dig into the garden metaphor first, because it genuinely surprised me. Usually, intense religious texts tell you to turn your brain off.
Yeah, just have faith.
Right, they tell you to just listen with your heart or rely purely on emotion. But this framework seems to demand the exact opposite.
It absolutely rejects the idea of blind emotional surrender. In the garden metaphor, the seed represents the divine word. But a seed cannot grow in the dirt on its own.
It requires water.
Exactly. And here, water strictly represents instruction, the active teaching from a guide. The vital mechanical detail is that this water must enter through the brain first.
So the brain isn't just some passive sponge, it's an active filtration system.
Precisely. The teaching enters the mind to be logically analyzed and processed. The mind has to be awake and active.
Okay.
Only after the brain verifies and processes the instruction does the truth finally settle down into the vessel.
Which is the human heart.
Right, where
Okay.
the seed can actually sprout.
That is so interesting. It's demanding intellectual engagement before spiritual transformation. That is a very specific cognitive mechanism. And then the worldview takes this exact same concept of transformation and moves it from the garden into a bakery.
The bakery parable decodes the human psyche with the same level of precision. It relies on the classic story of a woman hiding leaven, or yeast, into 3 measures of flour until the whole batch of dough rises.
Notice the 3 measures detail there, tying right back to the pattern of 3 companions we saw earlier.
Yeah, the architecture is very consistent. In this decoding, the dough or the flour represents the human heart, the vessel we just talked about, and the yeast is the teaching.
Okay, I follow.
Just as a tiny microscopic bit of yeast chemically alters, multiplies, and expands a massive lump of dough, the active teaching causes knowledge and truth to violently expand inside the human heart.
It fundamentally changes the molecular composition of the person. You aren't just flour and water anymore, you are something entirely new. But here is the catch. Because this massive internal transformation is completely dependent on the teacher providing that water or that yeast.
Right, the teacher is the catalyst.
Exactly. So the framework places an unbelievable amount of weight on the student-teacher relationship.
It argues that because the teacher initiates this profound internal growth, the teacher is quite literally giving birth to the believer's new identity. The teacher becomes a spiritual mother or father.
Wow.
They even cite the Apostle Paul, who famously referred to his followers as my children, for whom I am in the pains of childbirth.
And because they are your spiritual parents, the ideology demands filial piety, deep, unwavering, almost ancient honor and respect. In fact, it claims that this specific obedience to your spiritual parents is what ensures a long life.
It's borrowing heavily from traditional Eastern cultural values of respecting one's elders and ancestors, but it elevates that respect to an absolute spiritual imperative.
To disrespect the teacher who gave you the yeast is to disrespect the source of your own life.
Exactly.
I see where you're going, but here is where the logic takes a massive, almost paradoxical turn for me. The framework borrows from traditional culture to enforce obedience to the teacher, but then it completely goes to war with traditional culture when it comes to the content of the teaching.
Oh, absolutely.
We go from learning how bread is made to dealing with the expiration date of the bread.
This might be the most radical claim in the entire architecture. The ideology draws a stark, unforgiving line between old teachings and new teachings.
It claims that truth has an expiration date. I find this staggering. Most of us are taught that truth is eternal, right? If it was true 1,000 years ago, it's true today.
That's the standard view, yeah.
But this worldview says, just like eating yesterday's moldy bread will give you a terrible stomach ache, clinging to old teachings when a new instruction arrives will cause severe spiritual sickness.
It treats truth as something seasonal, almost perishable. What was perfectly nutritious and divinely ordained yesterday becomes toxic today, the moment a new era is announced.
And it uses the ancient Pharisees as the prime example of this toxicity. It discusses their ancient traditions, like the obsessive need to wash their hands and feet every time they came inside.
Right.
The language used actually likens this ancient ritual to modern germophobia or OCD. It completely dismisses these practices as human traditions that blinded them to the new instructions right in front of them.
And it extends far beyond biblical examples, too. The framework explicitly targets foundational cultural philosophies. It singles out the teachings of Confucius and Mencius, pillars of Eastern thought, as outdated human logic. It demands that followers utterly discard these ancient cultural cornerstones in order to become new dough or a new creation.
Let's just pause and think about the psychological weight of that demand. It essentially argues that loyalty to your historical culture, to your ancestors, could actively poison your spiritual future. That is an astronomical mental hurdle for anyone to clear.
It's huge.
To look at the values your family has held sacred for thousands of years and suddenly categorize them as moldy bread that will kill you.
The friction of that cultural inertia is massive. Most people won't abandon their entire heritage just because you ask nicely, which is exactly why the theology introduces apocalyptic imagery to force the issue.
Right.
It brings in the book of Revelation, specifically the imagery of the black horse, whose rider carries a pair of scales.
Why the scales? What does an apocalyptic horseman have to do with leaving behind Confucianism?
It provides the psychological leverage of ultimate stakes. The scales are used to meticulously measure the wheat, which represents human souls. The imagery details a denarius buying a measure of wheat, which is interpreted as a precise, terrifyingly exact exchange of God's new word for human salvation.
Wow. So it's life or death.
Exactly. By using the apocalypse, the framework is saying you aren't just updating your philosophy, you are being weighed on the scales of the end of the world. If you are caught holding old traditions, you will be found wanting.
That is intense.
It uses existential dread as the activation energy needed to break people away from their past.
That brings us to a really difficult reality, though. If the stakes are literally apocalyptic and the transition from old bread to new bread is that jarring, how does this closed-loop system handle the people who inevitably struggle? People who have doubts or who just can't drop their ancestral traditions overnight?
Well, because the transition is framed as a matter of life and death, the system allows for zero margin of error. It insists that uncompromising, brutal discipline is mandatory. There is no room for gentle persuasion or open debate.
The language takes a very sharp, dark turn here. The framework aggressively condemns anyone who refuses correction or tries to argue with their spiritual leaders. It explicitly says that if you refuse to accept the new teaching, or if you throw a tantrum, you are acting on the level of a beast, a pig, or a dog.
It leans on the biblical phrase, "Do not throw your pearls to swine," to justify cutting off or refusing to teach anyone who pushes back. The internal logic is that you cannot reason with a wild animal that only wants to bite the hand feeding it.
Right.
If a follower acts on the instinct of their old traditions and questions the new teaching, they are categorized as unteachable animals.
It's highly authoritarian. I'm picturing a martial arts dojo, but with eternal stakes. You don't question the sensei, you just execute the move.
That dojo analogy works really well, and the framework issues a very specific warning about a certain type of student, the person who is always learning but never understanding.
I found that detail fascinating because it explains why they fail to understand. The worldview doesn't blame a lack of intelligence. It's not about having a low IQ or poor reading comprehension.
No, not at all.
It attributes the failure entirely to a lack of humility and an arrogant attachment to old, expired traditions. They label it hypocrisy.
It's the illusion of learning. These individuals are sitting in the room, they're taking notes, their brains are filtering the water, but because they refuse to empty their cup, because they stubbornly refuse to throw away the moldy bread of their pre-existing beliefs, the new yeast literally has no space to expand. They might be intellectually engaged, but they are spiritually stubborn.
To survive within this architecture, the mandate is crystal clear. You must drop your ego and completely surrender to the correction. You are either an obedient vessel actively making room for the new yeast, or you are a hypocrite rotting from the inside out with moldy bread. The system just doesn't allow for a middle ground.
It requires total ideological displacement. You can't build a new house on a foundation of old, rotten wood. The old structure has to be demolished.
Well, this has been a truly intense journey through a complex metaphorical landscape today. I mean, we started with the jarring premise that facing persecution is the ultimate mathematical proof of truth. We looked at the strict mandate of growing up, transitioning from spiritual milk to solid meat. We explored the cognitive mechanics of how teaching acts like yeast violently expanding in the human heart, and how the brain has to actively filter the water before the seed can grow. And finally, we unpacked the terrifying psychological leverage used to force people to reject their expired traditional bread enforced by that strict dojo-like discipline.
A really heavy framework. But if we pull back from the intense theology for a moment, this deep dive actually forces us to look at our own relationship with information.
How so?
Well, as you go about your week, think about this. We spent all this time analyzing the danger of spiritual spoon-feeding and the necessity of chewing difficult meat. But look at our modern digital lives. The algorithms on our phones and social media feeds act exactly like that neurotic mother we talked about.
Oh, wow.
They are constantly, obsessively spoon-feeding us comforting milk, information we already agree with, opinions that validate our existing biases. They make absolutely sure we never have to chew on the difficult, uncomfortable meat of an opposing viewpoint.
That is a phenomenal point. The algorithm ensures we never face the pushback this theology claims is so vital.
Exactly. It raises a critical question for all of us. In an era where technology is designed to spoon-feed us comfort, are we entirely losing our ability to chew for ourselves?
Are our jaws getting weak? That is an incredible thought to leave on. Thank you for helping us decode this fascinating architecture. And thank you, the listener, for joining us on this deep dive. Take a hard look at your digital diet this week and ask yourself if you're surviving on milk when you really need meat. We'll catch you next time.